October 15, 1944, in the rubble-strewn streets of Aachen, Germany. In the shadow of crumbling walls, Anna clutched a tattered photo of her family, convinced the advancing Americans would bring only revenge and ruin, just as the radio had warned for years. She and women like her pushed into desperate survival in hidden rooms where dignity traded for scraps of food, whispered prayers for a quick end, rather than the horrors they imagined from the stories flooding in from the east. But as the first jeeps rolled through the fog-shrouded dawn, what they found shattered every lie they'd been fed about the enemy at their gates. Little did they know, a simple bar of soap would unlock a world of quiet dignity they never dreamed possible. Anna's hands trembled as she barricaded the door of the dim basement room, the distant rumble of tanks echoing her growing dread like thunder rolling closer with each passing hour. The air hung heavy with the smell of damp stone and unwashed fear. A place on the outskirts of Aachen where she and her friend Lena had hidden for weeks, scraping by in ways that left them hollow inside. Once, Anna had been one of those young women aiding the German war effort, what they called Helferinnen, operating radios and phones in the early days when victory seemed certain and the Reich's promises filled her with pride. But now, with the city under siege as the first major German town to face full Allied assault, survival meant doing whatever it took to avoid the bombs and the hunger that gnawed deeper than any propaganda speech. By late 1944, Aachen had become a focal point of the Western Front, where American forces under General Patton pushed through with over 100,000 troops, capturing the city after weeks of fierce street fighting that left thousands of civilians displaced and desperate. Reports from the Red Cross later estimated that more than 1,000 women in such liberated zones had been forced into informal networks of trade just to eat, their homes reduced to rubble by artillery shells that numbered in the tens of thousands during the siege. Simple ration cards, once a symbol of the fatherland's care, now meant lines that stretched endlessly for watery soup, while the advancing Allies seemed to carry endless supplies in their trucks. Anna pressed her back against the cold wall, belief Anna had built since her teenage years, when joining the League of German Girls had felt like stepping into destiny, full of marches and ideals that promised a pure world free from the chaos of the old ways. What Anna didn't yet grasp was how that doubt would widen into a chasm as the sounds outside shifted from explosions to the low hum of engines pulling up nearby. But the real test came when the door finally gave way, not with violence, but with a flashlight's beam cutting through the gloom like an unexpected hand extended in the night. The women's stories of Soviet atrocities from the East made the Americans seem almost merciful by comparison, though in the dim basement light, every shadow carried the weight of those grim warnings passed from mouth to mouth like forbidden secrets. Anna and Lena sat close on the threadbare mattress, their voices barely above a whisper as they traded fragments of horror from refugees who'd fled Berlin's fall. Tales of doors kicked in and lives upended in the dead of night. The air grew thicker with each word, the flicker of their single candle casting long faces on the walls, faces etched with the kind of fear that came not just from hunger, but from the slow poison of propaganda that had taught them to see all invaders as monsters wearing different uniforms. As the war dragged into its final, brutal months on the Western Front, the Red Army's push through Eastern Europe had freed over 20 million people from Nazi control, but at a cost that left deep scars on countless civilians, especially women caught in the crossfire of revenge for the Reich's earlier invasions. In contrast, the American forces, bound by the Geneva Convention's rules on prisoners and civilians, stressed discipline among their ranks, prosecuting more than 500 cases of misconduct by their own soldiers by the end of 1945 to maintain order and prevent the chaos seen elsewhere.
Simple things like military police patrols and clear directives from command kept most encounters from spiraling into the unchecked violence that had marked other fronts, turning what could have been a storm into something more like a reluctant occupation. Lena wiped her eyes with the sleeve of her faded dress, the one she'd worn since her days as a telephone operator in a Luftwaffe outpost, back when the skies belonged to Germany, and doubt what
Took root, making the waiting feel less like a sentence and more like the edge of something unknown. Dawn brought the first soldiers, and silence fell heavy as footsteps echoed just outside. The women's breaths held in unison against the creak of the world shifting beneath them. No shouts or guns drawn, just a young GI offering water from a canteen, his voice calm and edged with a Midwestern twang that cut through the basement's stale air like a question rather than a command. Anna froze in the corner, her heart pounding as the door swung open under the beam of a flashlight, expecting the rush of boots and rough hands that the radio had promised would come with the American horde. But instead, the soldier knelt at a respectful distance, his helmet casting a shadow that made him look almost human in the weak light. Lena clutched Anna's arm, her nails digging in. Both of them braced for the worst from these invaders painted as ruthless looters in every broadcast they'd heard since the war turned sour. Yet the man simply unscrewed the cap and held out the canteen, saying something about it being clean and cool from the stream nearby. As the first waves of American forces swept into Aachen in October 1944, securing the shattered city block by block after nearly 3 weeks of intense urban fighting, they brought with them a tide of supplies that overwhelmed the local scarcity, turning what locals saw as enemy advance into an unexpected source of relief for many displaced civilians. U.S. troops distributed around 10 million K-rations each week across the Western Front. These compact meals packed with canned meat, crackers, and even small luxuries like chewing gum or instant coffee that frontline soldiers shared with hungry locals as part of their occupation duties, a practice noted in countless post-war diaries from German women who marveled at the sheer volume pouring from Allied trucks. In Aachen alone, the rapid capture of the city on October 21st allowed for quick aid distribution, with military police setting up checkpoints not just to enforce order, but to hand out basic provisions, helping to prevent the kind of desperation-fueled chaos that had gripped other fronts. Anna took the canteen with shaking hand, delivered instead this quiet professionalism, a kindness that planted doubt like a seed in soil long thought barren. It was as if the war's lies, repeated so often they felt like truth, began to fade under the weight of one simple act, forcing Anna to wonder if the enemy she'd feared was more mirror than monster. But survival demanded more than water, as the soldiers outside began clearing the street, their radios crackling with orders that pulled the focus toward the next ruined building waiting in the morning light. In the brothel's back rooms, women like Lena bartered dignity for scraps of bread and fleeting warmth, their eyes hollow from endless nights that blurred into a haze of necessity and regret, the kind that settled deep in the bones like winter chill. Anna helped where she could, mending torn clothes by candlelight, or sharing the thin soup from whatever trades brought it in. But the weight of it all pressed on them during those long hours after the Americans had passed, leaving the basement feeling smaller, the walls closing in with memories of how far they'd fallen from the ideals that once lit their days. "It wasn't always like this," Lena would say in quiet moments, her voice trailing off as flashbacks pulled her back to the clean uniforms and sense of purpose that had drawn them into the war machine years before. A time when serving felt like building a future rather than clinging to survival. Before the bombs turned cities to dust, Anna and Lena had been part of the Helferinnen, young women who volunteered or were called up to support the German war effort as radio operators, secretaries, or switchboard girls in bustling offices that hummed with the confidence of early victories. By 1944, around 500,000 such women had served across the Reich, handling communications that kept the Wehrmacht moving from the Atlantic Wall to the Russian steppes. But as the Allies closed in, urban devastation from air raids, over 600,000 tons of bombs dropped on German cities that year alone, pushed thousands into desperate informal networks where families shattered and basic needs turned everyday people into shadows of themselves. In places like Aachen, the relentless artillery and house-to-house fighting displaced over 20,000 civilians in just weeks, forcing many women to seek shelter in hidden plagued America. Now, that fire felt like ash, stirring questions about the system that had abandoned its own so completely. Anna felt it too, the fracture widening in her thoughts, where old loyalties clashed with the betrayal of empty promises, hinting that the real defeat had started long before the tanks arrived, in the slow rot of ideals that couldn't feed a hungry soul. It was a quiet rebellion inside, one born of exhaustion rather than anger, making her wonder if the enemy outside might offer something the fatherland never could. Liberation promised change, but as the day wore on and more trucks rumbled past, the fear that had rooted them in place began to stir again, whispering that kindness was just a trick before the fall. A medic handed Anna a bar of soap, clean and scented with a faint hint of lavender, as if it were no more precious than a spare button in his kit, his gloved fingers extending it without fanfare, amid the bustle of the makeshift aid station set up in what used to be a schoolyard. The women were lined up gently by U.S. medics that afternoon, directed from the basement to this open space under gray skies, where tents flapped like white flags, and the smell of coffee from nearby trucks mingled with the earthiness of rain-soaked ground, pulling Anna and Lena into a process that felt strangely orderly, like stepping from nightmare into routine. She turned the bar over in her hands, its smooth weight foreign after months of rough substitutes made from recycled fats that left skin irritated and spirits lower. A small object that suddenly carried the weight of all she'd lost in the push and pull of survival. In the weeks following Aachen's liberation in late October 1944, American aid efforts extended beyond combat to basic welfare, distributing hygiene kits that reached up to 2 million displaced civilians across the Western Front by year's end. Packs containing soap, toothpaste, and razors sourced from stateside factories running at full wartime capacity. German rationing had slashed soap production to synthetic versions diluted with ash and chemicals, limiting civilians to mere grams per month, while the Reich prioritized munitions, a scarcity that turned cleanliness into a luxury, symbolizing the home front's collapse under endless air raids and knot in her chest. For the first time in what felt like forever, she caught a glimpse of herself in a shard of mirror propped nearby. Not the shadowed figure from the basement, but someone reclaiming a piece of the girl who'd once dreamed of a strong Reich. The act dismantling the old broadcast's sneers at American excess as empty rot, when this plenty felt like quiet salvation. Lena joined her, eyes softening as she washed her face, the scent evoking faint memories of pre-war markets, stirring a flicker of humanity that challenged the myths of a decadent foe too soft for real war, replacing dread with a tentative sense of being seen as whole again. It was in that simple rinse that the propaganda's grip loosened further, revealing cracks where truth could flow in, unbidden and undeniable. Clean bodies couldn't wash away the inner turmoil, as the medics waved them toward the next tent, where questions waited and the afternoon light stretched longer, hinting at paths yet to unfold. Lena stared at the fresh blanket, warmer and softer than anything she'd touched in months,
its woolen weave folded neatly on the cot in the corner of the holding area, a simple provision that seemed almost too kind to be real in the fading light of the afternoon. The medics had led the women from the aid tent to this fenced compound on Aachen's edge, a cluster of repurposed barns and tents ringed by barbed wire but patrolled gently, where groups of displaced locals were sorted and given space to rest, the air carrying the unfamiliar scent of canvas and distant cooking fires instead of the basement's mold. Anna unfolded the blanket beside her, draping it over her shoulders as they settled onto the straw-stuffed mattresses, the fabrics give against her skin pulling a quiet sigh from her lips. A small luxury that whispered of order amid the chaos, even as guards in olive drab moved methodically outside, their rifles slung low like tools rather than threats. By early 1945, as the Allied occupation deepened across Western Germany, makeshift camps like this one housed around 400,000 Germans, soldiers, civilians, and suspected officials, under U.S. and British control, with policies drawn from the Geneva Convention, requiring separate quarters for women to ensure privacy and safety.
Calm under the watchful eye of military government teams. Lena pulled the blanket tighter, its warmth seeping into her chilled frame and stirring a wave of memories from home, where her mother and sisters huddled in a drafty Berlin flat without such comforts, making this unexpected care feel like a guilty indulgence that twisted her thoughts toward the lies she'd swallowed about these Americans as heartless invaders. The propaganda had drilled it deep. The enemy was crude and cruel, their wealth a sign of weakness, yet here was proof in soft wool and steady hands, forcing her to face how the Reich had hoarded while its people suffered. A betrayal that planted seeds of anger not at the outsiders, but at the voices that had kept her blind for so long. Anna felt it too, the linen's cleanliness evoking a pang for her own family back east, their letters full of want that now mirrored her own shattered faith, the small act of provision cracking the myth wider and leaving her with a quiet sorrow for the world she'd defended so fiercely. It was as if the blanket wrapped not just her body, but the fragile beginnings of doubt, warming a path to questions she hadn't dared ask before. As days passed in the compound's rhythm of roll calls and meals, conversations began to flow among the women, tentative at first, bridging the silence that fear had built. An interpreter's gentle questions opened doors Anna thought sealed forever. His notebook poised like a neutral ground where words could fall without immediate judgment, drawing out stories in the evening hush of the compound's common area lit by hanging bulbs that cast a soft glow on the faces gathered around. The women sat in a loose circle on benches scavenged from the ruins, Anna and Lena among them, as the American officer, young, with a faint accent from New York streets, leaned forward, asking about their lives before the bombs, not with accusation, but curiosity, his tone making the air feel less like interrogation and more like the neighborly chats Anna remembered from her village days long past. Bonds formed tentatively across the lines, as a few locals who'd stayed neutral shared their own tales of ration lines and lost sons, the exchange weaving a fragile web of understanding that surprised even the guards watching from the shadows, turning stranger pivotal moments of revelation during such talks, moments that humanized the occupiers and began eroding years of indoctrination. By 1945, as part of broader efforts to foster cooperation, these psychological operations had processed over 100,000 civilians in holding areas, using questions about daily life to build trust and subtly challenge Nazi narratives, with many accounts noting how the lack of hostility led to unexpected confessions of doubt about the regime. Vulnerability led to tears as Anna spoke of her family scattered by the evacuations, her voice cracking when she mentioned the letters that stopped coming from the East, realizing in the interpreter's steady gaze that these Americans saw her not as the enemy painted in posters, but as a person caught in the same storm, eroding the worldview she'd clung to like a shield. Lena followed, her words halting at first, then flowing about the rallies that once filled her with purpose. The gentle nods around the circle, stripping away the isolation, and forcing her to confront how the propaganda had isolated her from truth. Each shared sentence a step toward seeing humanity on both sides. It was a profound shift, the tears not just of pain, but release, as the myth of the merciless foe dissolved into the reality of listening ears, leaving Anna with a hollow space where old certainties had been, now filling slowly with the possibility of something kinder. But not all shadows lifted easily. As the night deepened and the questions turned to the harder truths waiting just beyond the tent's flap. Nights brought flashbacks, hands scrubbing skin raw in the dark as if to erase the invisible stains of survival's toll. Anna sitting alone on her cot with a damp cloth. The compound's quiet, broken only by distant coughs and the occasional shift of someone restless in sleep. The other women stirred in their corners too, shadows moving like ghosts under the thin blankets, each lost in private battles where the war's echoes refused to fade, turning rest into another form of waiting amid the soft snores and the faint patter of rain on the tent roof. Lena lay nearby, eyes open to the ceiling, her breaths shallow as memories surfaced unbidden, the weight of those basement nights pressing down heavier than any rationed meal. A cycle of washing that soothed the body, but stirred the mind deeper into the hurt. Counseling, helping to identify those overwhelmed by trauma and connecting them to available resources amid the flood of civilians seeking aid. These efforts, though limited by the Army's focus on logistics and security, marked a shift from combat medicine to civilian welfare, with reports noting how medics distributed not just physical supplies, but encouragement to speak, easing some of the isolation that compounded the inner wounds left by years of fear and loss. The contrast amplified the pain for Anna, as the clean linens and steady care now thrown into sharp relief against what the war had stolen, family ties severed, trust shattered, and a sense of self buried under the Reich's broken promises, fostering a quiet rage not at the Americans, but at the leaders who'd marched them into this abyss with songs of glory that rang hollow now. Lena felt it rising too during those dark hours, the dignity offered like soap and blankets highlighting the regime's neglect, turning her old loyalty into a bitter taste that fueled questions about the ideals she'd sacrificed so much for, the trauma twisting into a slow-burning awareness of betrayal. It was in these solitary rituals of scrubbing, meant to cleanse, that the inner turmoil peaked, the kindness around them a mirror showing the true cost of the fight, stirring a profound sorrow that whispered of change yet to come. One conversation in the dim morning light changed everything, pulling Anna and Lena toward the edge of understanding they hadn't known they sought. Facing a mirror for the first time in months, Anna saw not a victim, but a survivor. Her reflection in the polished tin plate held by a medic during the morning aid session, catching the light in a way that made her eyes look clearer, less shadowed by the endless hiding and hurt. The group of about a dozen women gathered in the compound's larger tent that day, under the steady watch of 2 interpreters and a nurse, sharing bits of their stories as part of the routine checks that had become a strange anchor in their days. The air thick with the scent of fresh bandages and the faint echo of laughter from children playing outside for the first time without fear. Lena sat beside her, fingers twisting the edge of her blanket, when an older woman named Greta broke the pattern, her voice steady but low as she spoke of the soap and clean sheets that had come unasked. Advanced deep into Germany, over 8 million civilians and soldiers came under their control in the occupied zones, from the Rhine to the Elbe. Encounters that filled countless diaries with tales of the shock of plenty, endless crates of canned goods, fuel, and basics that shattered the propagandist's image of a weak, grasping America, paving the way for denazification programs where such revelations prompted confessions and shifts in loyalties. These processes, starting informally in places like Aachen's holding areas and expanding under U.S. military government directives, interviewed hundreds of thousands of women and men by mid-1945, using survivor testimonies to expose the lies of the Reich, with many accounts detailing how simple acts of provision led to broader awakenings, eroding the Nazi worldview through personal doubt rather than force. In the western sectors alone, Allied teams documented over 1.5 million cases of initial aid distribution that month, a logistical feat that not only stabilized the chaos, but quietly dismantled years of indoctrination, as women like those in the tent began questioning the broadcasts that had promised victory and purity amid the ruins. Overwhelmed, Anna reached for the diary page, her fingers brushing Lena's as they read together, the words hitting like the first real light after blackout nights, forcing a flood of memories where the radio's boasts clashed against the trucks unloading apples and bread without demand, the dignity in a medic's nod stripping away the fear she'd worn like armor. Lena's breath caught, tears tracing paths down her cheeks as she whispered about the Helferinnen days when she'd cheered the marches, now seeing how the abundance around them, soap that lathered true, blankets that warmed without strings, proved the Reich's defeat had started in factories far away, not on the fields, her old pride crumbling into empathy for these men who'd lost brothers too, yet shared anyway. It was a peak of raw clarity in that circle, ideologies falling like the bombed-out walls of Aachen, the war lost not in grand battles, but in hearts opened by quiet humanity, leaving Anna and the others with a profound, aching freedom, the kind that hurt before it healed. The group fell silent then, hands clasped across the divide. Debris to a nearby warehouse turned distribution point, where they helped sort donated clothes for other displaced families, the work giving hands a purpose that eased the idle thoughts circling like snowflakes in their minds. Back among the tents, community formed in quiet ways, a shared pot of stew brewed from American rations, stories exchanged over mended hymns, the group knitting scarves from yarn scraps that symbolized not just warmth, but the weaving back of lives unraveled by the years of fear and flight, each stitch a nod to the resilience that had carried them this far. In the immediate aftermath of battles like Aachen's in late 1944, U.S. occupation forces fed around 1.5 million civilians in western zones through organized relief stations, precursor efforts to the full Marshall Plan that would pour billions into Europe's recovery by 1948, starting with emergency aid that included clothing drives and work programs to reintegrate women into society and prevent collapse amid the hunger that gripped the region. These initiatives, coordinated by military government teams, offered jobs like laundry or clerical work to thousands of displaced women by early 1945, helping them rebuild networks shattered by evacuation orders and air raids, with reports from the time highlighting how such programs not only distributed goods, but fostered a sense of agency, turning passive survivors into active participants in their own healing. As the front lines stabilized, this aid extended to vocational training in camps, drawing from Geneva Convention guidelines to respect civilians' dignity, a foundation that later bloomed into broader economic revival, where women's labor became key to stitching communities back together. Anna paused during a sorting shift, holding up a child's sweater that reminded her of her niece back home, the fabric soft from stateside mills, and felt a bittersweet peace settle in, the abundance teaching her that strength lay not in the old slogans of unbreakable will, but in this quiet endurance, though the scars of doubt and loss tugged like loose threads, reminders that some wounds knit slower than others. Lena, folding blankets nearby,
nodded through her own reflections, the work mirroring the transformation inside, where the Reich's empty victories faded against the real plenty of shared meals and
out to passers-by, her steps lighter as she carried a small parcel of mended clothes to a neighbor's door, the simple errand feeling like a return to the rhythm of life she'd almost forgotten. Lena had left the compound weeks before, heading east to find traces of her family, their parting a quiet hug at the gate with promises to write. The bar of soap Anna still kept tucked in her pocket, now a talisman brushed smooth from daily handling, evoking the turning point that had washed away more than dirt. The two friends had crossed paths once more in a market square, sharing a coffee amid the growing crowds, their talk turning to the lessons of plenty and kindness that had reshaped their views, parting again with resolve in their eyes, the symbols of recovery, clean linens folded at home, a steady job sorting mail, standing as quiet victories over the despair that once bound them. By 1946, as the occupation shifted toward reconstruction in the U.S. zone, most displaced women like Anna had reintegrated into society, finding work in clerical roles or aid distribution that numbered in the hundreds of thousands, with survivor accounts emphasizing how American-provided hygiene and provisions played key roles in emotional healing and community rebuilding after the war's end. These women, often starting from rubble clearance crews known as Trümmerfrauen, who cleared over 20 million cubic meters of debris by year's end, transitioned to stable jobs under programs that valued their skills. Accounts from the time noting the profound impact of small dignities like real soap in restoring self-worth and fostering trust in the new order. Denazification questionnaires processed over 13 million Germans that year, with women's testimonies highlighting the shock of plenty as a catalyst for ideological shifts, proving humanity's quiet power in mending what ideology had torn. Full circle came for Anna in those walks. From the basement's shadows to this fragile normalcy, the soap's faint scent a reminder that dignity's fragility mirrored the old belief's collapse, proving war's true defeat lay in hearts opened to unexpected grace, leaving her with a resolved peace, laced with the ache of what was lost, but grateful for the humanity that endured. Lena's letters arrived sporadically, words of similar awakenings. The women's paths diverged